Hi, Pastor Ed here, back from vacation with a weekly devotion for Thursday, July the 9th. I'm going to start this evening or today and the next 3 weeks as well, talking about the will of God, particularly as it was explored and explained by a pastor by the name of Leslie Weatherhead, who wrote during the Second World War, as I'll share in just a moment. But first, the story to begin. Pastor's car once broke down on a country road, and so he walked to the closest building, which just happened to be a nearby tavern, to use their phone. And after calling for a tow truck, he spotted his old friend Frank, looking rather ragged and unkempt, and with a 3-day-old beard, slumped over the bar with a collection of empty shot glasses stacked in front of him. "What happened, Frank?" asked the preacher. "You used to be rich." Well, in response to this question, Frank told a sad tale of bad investments that had led to his downfall. "Go home," said the preacher. "Open your Bible at random. Just stick your finger on the page, and there you will find God's answer for your situation and God's will for your life." Well, months later, the same preacher bumped into his old friend again downtown, but this time in front of the bank. Only now Frank was wearing a Gucci suit, sported a Rolex watch, and just happened to step out of a new Mercedes that was parked by the curb. "Frank," the preacher called out, "I'm so glad to see that things really turned around for you." "Yeah, preacher," said Frank, "and I owe it all to you. I opened my Bible just like you said. I put my finger down on the page, and there was the answer staring back at me in black and white." "Well, what did it say?" asked the preacher anxiously. And so Frank told him. It said, chapter 11. The late Joseph Sittler, one of the leading Lutheran theologians of the 20th century, once wrote of a somewhat similar experience that he had having to do with the will of God and parking spaces. Once at a church where I was the interim pastor, he writes, there was a woman who used prayer as a kind of personal lubricant to everything she wanted. She worked at a hospital in Chicago, and she used to tell me, every morning when I drive from my house to the hospital, I pray to Jesus that he'll find me a parking space. And you know, Pastor, he always does. And I kept thinking to myself, says Sittler, what kind of God relationship is built on this parking space finding Jesus? Will it sustain this woman in profound deprivation and tragedy? Is it enough? Well, one Sunday morning, Sittler writes, I said to her, "Emma, suppose there's another woman driving in the second lane on the highway, taking a sick child to the hospital, and you drive right into the parking space that Jesus found for you, and this woman who's frantic with a sick child can't find a space. How about her?" "Well, she just didn't pray hard enough," was the quick response. And that really stumped me, he says. So I tried to think of how to correct her, but she was immune to argument. Well, finally I found one, he writes, and I'm sinfully proud of it. I think it was a straight gift. The next time I saw her, I said, "You know, this speech you give me about Jesus finding you a parking space, Emma, well, what do you suppose Mary was praying about jogging along on that donkey on her way to Bethlehem?" Emma never mentioned the topic again. If Mary couldn't find a parking space in which to have a baby, particularly that baby, then there must be something wrong with the parking space finding Jesus, he concluded. In other words, there's something obviously wrong with trying to understand God's will in this way. Now, these stories, humorous and somewhat inconsequential though they may be, are nevertheless point us to a far more serious and critical issue. And that's simply this: what do we mean when we use that oft-spoken phrase, the will of God? In other words, what exactly are we implying here? Are we saying, for instance, that absolutely everything which happens in this life is somehow part of God's plan? That nothing happens in this world unless God preordains it? Certainly those who believe that God will find them a parking space in response to their faithfulness and prayers, and in order to make their lives a little bit easier, I might add, must apparently feel this way. But what about those terrible things that also happen in life? War, famine, disease, disaster, both natural and man-made. Are they ordained by God as well? Does God intend for them to happen in order to serve some hidden yet useful purpose? I guess my own struggle with this issue goes back almost 30 years now to when we were living in New Jersey the first time, serving in Piscataway. And I happened to be watching the news on TV, and that particular evening there was an especially sad story on the news about an 8-year-old boy who had been killed in New York City just several days before in a drug-related drive-by shooting. It was another senseless tragedy. The young boy had been out playing on the sidewalk in front of his house one afternoon when he got caught in the crossfire of a turf war between rival drug gangs. Now, the story itself was bad enough, but what really bothered me was the clip of this little boy's funeral service earlier that day, which had been attended by several hundred mourners from all over the city. And in the brief clip, which was broadcast on the evening news, the family's pastor had the audacity to say that the boy's death had been the will of God. Because this little boy had the misfortune of growing up in such a bad neighborhood, said the preacher, full of drugs and crime and violence, God had simply decided to take his life early in order to spare him any further suffering or pain later on. After all, if he had lived, speculated the pastor, he would likely grown up to enter the world of drugs and crime himself as well, would have ended up, as so many do, in that poverty-stricken community, either in prison or dead from a drug overdose. But because God loved him, said the preacher, he had mercifully spared him such a fate. By having him shot and killed on the sidewalk in front of his house while he was playing? A precious, innocent 8-year-old boy? What kind of God would do such a thing? Now contrast this with another funeral sermon, one written by a Lutheran pastor. The late Maurice Moe White was a pastor who served in Massillon, Ohio, and during Lent one year, an elderly member of his congregation fell down the outside steps while leaving church, and their midweek service broke her hip. And for some unknown reason, she did not recover from the subsequent hip surgery, and she died a few days later. Pastor White stood by the casket with the bereaved husband the night before her funeral, and many people came by to pay their respects and to offer their condolences, but a number of well-meaning friends kept saying to this grieving husband things like, well, God must have a plan for this, so we just have to accept it. Others said, it was God's will, we have to live with it. Still others said, somehow God planned this to test your faith. And still others even said, there's a silver lining in every cloud. You'll find God's reason behind this eventually. And Pastor White left the funeral home that night very angry at what he called the babbling that he had heard that evening. And so he went directly to his study. He rewrote the opening of his funeral sermon. And the next morning he opened his sermon with the words, my God does not push old ladies down church steps. And he then proceeded to explain that God cannot be blamed for all the brokenness in this world. If God is the author of death, he said, how can he be at the same time the author of life? As shown through the resurrection of Jesus Christ that we celebrate every Sunday and especially on Easter. Is God the God of the living or the God of the dead? He asked them point blank. You can't have it both ways, he told the congregation. Years ago, while I was down in Georgia and leading a Bible study, just after I had related this story of the little boy shot to death in front of his house, one of the participants told us about a book that she had once read entitled The Will of God. It was written by an English pastor during the Second World War. His name was Leslie D. Weatherhead, and he had apparently given a series of sermons to his congregation, the City Temple in London, which was intended to focus on this very question. These sermons on the will of God were then later turned into a book of the same name, which quickly became a classic, although somehow I had never heard of it before. And so this woman loaned me her copy, and after reading it several times, I went out the next day, bought one for myself. And soon after, I decided that its message was one worth sharing with others. You see, living through and experiencing firsthand the suffering and carnage that was the Second World War, with all of its destruction and death, tens of millions on the battlefield, millions more in the concentration camps, countless others maimed and or left homeless, the question of what exactly was the will of God was undoubtedly a pressing one for Weatherhead and his congregation, and indeed the entire world at that time. In other words, how could God, a loving God, have allowed all of this to happen, or far worse, had purposely intended for it to happen? All of that death and destruction, and how could the evil and grisly horror which had been the Holocaust have possibly served some useful purpose? Well, this week and for the next 3 weeks as well, I'm going to use Dr. Weatherhead's classic book. Well over 1 million copies have been sold to date. Sort of a jumping off point for our own discussion of this critical theme. But even in our own time, and especially with the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Iran, not to mention the global environmental crisis that we're living through, the genocide and starvation across the globe. We talk a lot about God's will, as well we should. But it would be helpful, I think, to know exactly what we mean, or perhaps should mean, when we use that powerful yet problematic phrase. Weatherhead, in fact, opens his book by saying the phrase, the will of God, is so used so loosely, and the consequence of that looseness to our peace of mind is so serious, that I want to spend some time in thinking through with you the whole subject. There's nothing about which we ought to think more clearly, writes Weatherhead, and yet I sometimes think there's nothing about which men and women are more confused. And he then goes on to offer the following illustration. The wife of a friend of his had recently died, and after her death, the friend had remarked, as we so often do, well, I must just accept it. It's the will of God. But Weatherhead then immediately points out that this friend was also a doctor. And for weeks, he had actually been fighting for her life with every drug, every treatment that he had available to him. However, if, as Weatherhead, her death was the will of God, then was he all the time fighting against God's will? And yet, if she had recovered, would he not have called her recovery the will of God as well? Makes me stop and think about the death of my cousin Lynn Clifford years ago. For some reason, she had struggled against a particular virulent form of leukemia. Her doctors had also been doing everything in their power to help her. Lynn's mom, my late Aunt Olga, told me that when Lynn was admitted to the hospital for the final time, she weighed 122 pounds, but by the time she died, just several weeks later, she weighed 152 pounds from all the drugs they'd been pumping into her body, all the treatments they'd been exposing her to in order to try and keep her alive. To the very end, her doctors had been trying to save her, but unfortunately her death was an excruciatingly painful one. Her legs, said my aunt, had swelled from the treatments to become like tree trunks. Eddie, she said, they felt like they were made from concrete, and she was in so much pain. And so I asked the question, what was the will of God in this instance? When I spoke with my aunt on the phone after Lynn's death, she was resigned, as many of us are in such circumstances, to simply trust in faith that it was somehow God's will, part of God's plan. But again, what if she had survived? Surely we cannot have it both ways, writes Weatherhead. A person's recovery and a person's death cannot equally be the will of God in the sense of being God's intention. Or to use another example, while our current war in Iran is not on the same scale as World War II, what do we say to the parents of the soldiers or Marines, the service people who have been killed? That it was the will of God? No, Weatherhead would say it was the will of our enemy, perhaps, but it is not the intention or the will of God. If you want a sermon text for this, wrote Weatherhead, then you'll find it in the 18th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, the 14th verse. It is not, I repeat, not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. Other translations use here the word perish. Rather, God is a God who saves, not a God who kills. God is a God who goes in search of the lost one, leaving the 99 behind, a God who cares that much. And such a God would never willingly afflict or grieve anyone, as we read in Lamentations 3, verse 33. And then there's 1 Timothy 2, verse 4, which reminds us that God, our Savior, desires everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. In fact, if you go all the way back to the very beginning, to the creation, that everything that God made, every plant and tree, every beast of the earth, bird of the air, everything, in short, that has the breath of life, including humankind, was created good. As we heard, when he had finished with creation on the sixth day, God saw everything he had made. Indeed, it was very good. That was God's intention. That was God's will, which is simply to say that whenever we see suffering and pain and death and tragedy in our world, they are in most cases not the will of God. The exception, of course, is that as human beings, it's also true that we were created by God to be mortal. And certainly in that sense, we are not somehow immune to disease or death or to pain or suffering. But we can also safely say that these things were not intended by God to serve any useful or necessary purpose. They're simply a fact of life, a part of the human experience, an element of the created order. And actually, if and when they come, they may very well be instead the result of human disobedience and sinfulness, as opposed to our God-given mortality and finitude. That is, they may be real, they may have be an inescapable part of life, but they are not a part of God's plan for us, especially when we bring them upon ourselves. The well-known pastor and preacher William Sloane Coffin, who for many years served New York's Riverside Church, once wrote an article after the death of his own son, Alex. The night after Alex died, he writes, "I was sitting in the living room of my sister's house outside of Boston when a middle-aged lady came in and shook her head and said, 'I just don't understand the will of God.' And instantly," wrote Coffin, "I was up in hot pursuit, swarming all over. 'I'll say you don't, lady,' he snarled. 'Do you think it was the will of God that Alex never fixed that lousy windshield wiper of his, that he was probably driving too fast in such a storm that he probably had a couple of Frosties too many? Do you think it's God's will that there's no street signs along that stretch of the road, no guardrails separating the road from Boston Harbor?'" Dr. Coffin continued in his article, "Nothing infuriates me as the incapacity of seemingly intelligent people to get it through their heads that God doesn't go around this world with his fingers on the trigger, his fists around knives, his hands on steering wheels. God is against all unnatural deaths, and Christ spent an inordinate amount of time delivering people from paralysis, insanity, leprosy, and muteness. And then he concluded, the one thing that should never be said when someone dies is, 'It's the will of God.' Never do we know enough to say that. My consolation lies in knowing that it was not the will of God that Alex die, that when the waves closed over the sinking car, God was the first of all of our hearts to break." Well, because of all this confusion over the will of God, Weatherhead's own thinking resulted in a division of the subject, as he puts it, into three parts. First, there's what he calls the intentional will of God that I've been talking about here with you today. The realization that everything God created, including human beings, was good. And furthermore, that it's not the will of God for anyone to perish, but rather God desires everyone to be saved. Secondly, Weatherhead believed in the circumstantial will of God. And that's what we'll be looking at more closely next week. For Weatherhead, the circumstantial will of God is God's response to human evil and sinfulness. God's intention may have been one thing, but often we ignore or rebel against God's intentions. And so how God reacts and what God does in response to these circumstances is what Weatherhead meant when he talked about the circumstantial will of God. And finally, there is, says Weatherhead, the ultimate will of God. And here he means God's ultimate goal, the way in which God still achieves his gracious purposes despite our rebellion and disobedience, despite the evil that exists in our world. As Weatherhead writes, God cannot finally be defeated, not that everything that happens is his will, but that nothing can happen which finally defeats his will. However, Weatherhead readily admits that there are two difficulties inherent in this line of thinking. The first, he writes, may be put like this: people get a lot of comfort from supposing that their tragedies are the will of God. I think again of my Aunt Olga, who tried to find some comfort in my cousin Lynn's death by trusting that there was some plan at work, some greater purpose being served that we're just not able to see as yet. Weatherhead responds, admittedly, there's a time when things can be said, there's a time when they cannot be said, however true they may be. If you're standing in the presence of some great tragedy, there is little that you can say about the will of God. But I would go on immediately to add this. He writes, there is never any final comfort in a lie. In the end, he argues, this lie will let us down because it doesn't offer us any true hope. Because inevitably we'll be confronted with the horrific realization that either God is a supposedly loving God who purposely inflicts us with pain and suffering, or the only other logical possibility, namely that God therefore is not a loving God at all, but some kind of monstrous fiend instead. And neither possibility is ultimately very acceptable or satisfying. Most of you probably heard of the late Ted Turner, the founder of CNN and TNT and TBS, and once was even owner of the Atlanta Braves baseball team. He was a very successful businessman, billionaire, also the well-known critic of Christianity. In fact, he's been quoted as saying that Christianity is for losers. What's not so well known is how Ted Turner became so anti-Christian. It seems, according to numerous newspaper accounts, that as a teenager, Turner actually aspired to become a missionary, but then lost his faith when his younger sister, Mary Jane, contracted an immune system disease that ultimately took her life. I was taught that God was love, said Turner, and God was powerful, and I couldn't understand how someone so innocent should be made or allowed to suffer so. There's also, says Weatherhead, a second objection that may be expressed in this way. It's all very well to keep the phrase the will of God for the good and joyous and healthy and beneficial things that happen to people, but isn't it true that some of the greatest qualities in people are discovered through suffering, and therefore it's not that suffering, and therefore is not that suffering itself the will of God? We all know of stories where people emerge from great suffering and tragedy with a newfound strength and sense of purpose. Could it not be said then that God intended for this suffering or this tragedy to happen in order for this transformation to take place? Weatherhead uses the example here of the courage that many men and women discovered during the Second World War. We could say the same of those who fought in any of our wars or conflicts. The problem, he says, is that there's a flaw in this logic as well as a false implication for theology. Simply put, if we say that the suffering caused by an evil is essential because of the qualities evoked, then logically we must assume that God somehow needs evil in order to produce good, that he couldn't produce such a thing unless an evil like war demanded it. Furthermore, he argues by that same flawed logic, Jesus was actually removing something essential to the soul when he went around healing people during his earthly ministry. In other words, Jesus was indeed taking away their opportunity for growth and development. Instead, argues Weatherhead, the great qualities in human nature are not given birth by evil. God creates them, and they're sometimes revealed by the right reaction of good people to evil, but they do not depend for their origin on evil, for they can be evoked by a response to the good as well. So let us be very careful how we use that phrase, the will of God, he concludes. Martin Luther, of course, often talked about the hidden and the revealed will of God. The hidden will of God is that which will forever remain mysterious and unknown to us in this life. The revealed will of God, however, is what God has demonstrated for us in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is great suffering in our world. There are many who mourn the death of loved ones. But God did not intend for this suffering and sadness. It was not his will. Rather, God's gracious will was demonstrated for us on a cross, where his Son took all that suffering and pain and all that evil, even death itself, and forever broke its chokehold on the human race. God's gracious will was also demonstrated for us in an empty tomb on the third day, and the promise of forgiveness, not judgment, of joy, not sorrow, of life, not death. Amen. Hope your week is going well for you so far. Invite you to come and be a part of our worship this coming Sunday. You may have read in the Anchor that I'm starting a sermon series on the book of Revelation. Hardly ever appeared in the lectionary, and now we're going to have 7 weeks of working through. I'm a little kind of scared about that because there's so many misconceptions about the book of Revelation, but I think it'll be an interesting time, and hope you can join us for that. And I'll be back again with you next week for the second installment in talking about the will of God, as Leslie Weatherhead kind of worked out that way of looking at it that I explained moments ago. Until then, take care. Bye.